Hello and welcome back. This is the second installment of the breakdown of Nietzsche's Use and Abuse of History for Life essay. In the first section, I described the three modes of history: um, antiquarian, monumental, and critical. And you can watch the first video if you want to know more about that. But in this part, I'm just going to go into basically Nietzsche's kind of overall kind of commentary on history and historical education, um, and his critique, I suppose, of historical education. Now we know from the first section that all these different uses of history, antiquarian, monumental, and critical, all contain in them values. They're valuable in some sense. They attempt to use history to I suppose increase life. And what does that mean? Increase life? Well, that's a good question. um, I think in general it means to create values, to create priorities, to to create a project, a goal. Many of the Nietzschean pursuits, basically. History is useful for how that use works is complicated, obviously, but roughly speaking. And these modes of history are all potentially useful and also at the same time potentially harmful of that larger Nietzschean project. And we know from the first installment that the um, the task here, which is spelled out at the very beginning of this essay, is to sort of strip away the excess and get to the essential. We want to get rid of the superfluous and get to what is essential in our study of history. And we don't want a study of history which is detrimental to the future, for example. We don't want a study of history which somehow suffocates the present. We don't want to, there's lots of different dangers with history. The most obvious example today would probably be something like, this overly moralistic view of history, kind of, which is actually developed into a kind of inherited sin problem, at least for Westerners anyway, where, kind of historical crimes and so forth are taught with this very moralistic posture, which sort of implies some sort of inherited guilt. I mean, this is just one example of how history can be misused. And then, of course, that's bad because it destroys life in the present. It destroys the future. It inhibits the future. It suffocates us and so forth. So there's this is one example of how history could be useful or detrimental to the present and the future. Nietzsche's critique basically could be summarized as a critique of an excess of knowledge. That we presume in the Enlightenment that more knowledge is good. Well, Nietzsche's arguing the opposite, that too much knowledge could be detrimental. And there's many different ways he's going to play out these criticisms. And the second half of the essay is basically just him kind of riffing off of these criticisms of historical education as a kind of crisis in too much knowledge. So, for example, in one paragraph, he criticizes contemporary man as being a kind of walking encyclopedia. He says a contemporary man magically taken back into that world would presumably find the Greeks very uneducated, right? So this is like if you put us back, or the 19th century, late 19th century, educated person of Nietzsche's time, put him back in ancient Greece, he would probably think the Greeks were uneducated. Okay, so continuing here, he says, in that reaction, of course, the secret of modern education, so painstakingly disguised, would be exposed to public laughter, for we modern people have nothing at all which comes from us, only because we fill and overfill ourselves with foreign ages, customs, arts, philosophies, religions, and discoveries, do we become something worthy of consideration. That is, like wandering encyclopedias, as some ancient Greek lost in our time would put it. So again, it's a kind of crisis where nothing comes from us. We borrow and borrow and borrow from the past, to the point where we don't really have a kind of unique individual subjectivity, we can nearly say. Not to say that obviously all subjectivities are influenced by the past, influenced by history, but there's a remarkably there's a remarkable lack of character to the man of Nietzsche's time, in that he borrows everything from the past, and he doesn't really have his own form, his own character, we could say, his own subjectivity, we could say, or at least that subjectivity and that character is very weak. It's not very pronounced. It's not very well developed. Again, I brought up Mark Fisher in the first video, and Mark Fisher made the same point about music. He said that from like the 60s up until like the kind of 2000s, early 2000s, there was every decade there was a very distinct kind of musical development, and that subjectivity and that character was being expressed through very unique musical development that people were able to create, like new genres of particularly rock music, actually. Not exclusively, but I think particularly rock music. To a lesser extent, I think pop, electronic, and rap music, but really rock music, there was a really pronounced and a really defined individual character to each decade. The 80s rock music was very different than the 90s, 70s, 60s. So for about 50 years, 50 years, there was a very pronounced character. And then that sort of just went away. And then I think what started happening was that people were just like, people making music in like 2010, for example, were just like making 90s music, making grunge music, making 60s music, making jungle music, making whatever. They were just making or sort of mixing together a little bit different previous decades of musical sounds, and they weren't really creating anything new, and there was a kind of stagnation of creativity. And Mark Fisher, I think, picked up on this theme from Nietzsche. Nietzsche was criticizing this in a kind of broader sense of culture. One of the interesting symptoms of these sorts of culturally stagnated times, we could say, is a kind of inwardness. A kind of inwardness develops. So I'll read out this section here. He says, "This inward life can, to a rare degree, prove delicately sensitive, serious, strong, and sincere, and perhaps even richer than the inward lives of other peoples." He's talking about the Germans here as well. But as a totality, it remains weak because all the beautiful threads are not tied together into a powerful knot. Thus, the visible act is not the total action and self-revelation of this inner life, but only a weak and crude attempt of a few strands or other to will something whose appearance might pass muster as the totality. Thus, one cannot judge the German according to a single action. As an individual, he is still completely hidden after the action. As is well known, he must be measured by his thoughts and feelings, and they speak out nowadays in his books. If only these books did not awaken in recent times more than ever a doubt about whether the famous inner life is really still sitting in its inaccessible little temple. It would be a horrible idea that one day it may have disappeared, and now the only thing left behind is the externality, that arrogant, clumsy, and respectfully unkept German externality. Almost as terrible as if that inner life, without people able to see it, sat inside, counterfeit, colored, painted over, and had become an actress, if not something worse, as for example, Grill Parzer, I don't know who that is, but I must look that up. Who stood on the sidelines as a quiet observer, appears to assume about as experienced as a dramatist in the theater. We feel with abstractions, he says. We hardly know any more how feeling expresses. Next page. Itself among our contemporaries. We let our feelings jump about in ways they do not affect us anymore. Shakespeare's okay. He talked about Shakespeare then, but so there's a kind of, I think he's kind of describing this kind of inward character. I think a kind of reflexive character, typically German, kind of reflexive and thoughtful character. Um, but it's kind of lacking a unity. Um, and it again, it's almost like he's kind of describing someone who's increasingly borrowing from different parts. And again, I think this is such a relevant essay for our time because I think this is exactly what we call quiche, or however you pronounce it. You see this like this borrowing. I don't know, like they made this television show a while back, Stranger Things. It was like they're borrowing from 80s, and everyone's like, "Ooh, the 80s are back." And then recently in the UK, you had Oasis do a comeback tour. So it's like we're borrowing from the early 2000s. So it's like this kind of a comeback, nostalgia comeback, kind of borrowing. And even online today, people are borrowing from, on the right wing at least, people are kind of borrowing from aesthetics of, antiquity, for example. There's this kind of constant like wearing other people's clothes, borrowing, and we're kind of putting it all together very crudely, trying to conjure up a kind of formed character, a formed whole, a unity out of a kind of mass of different parts, nearly. Um, um, so there's a kind of there's a kind of sense of incompleteness here with these people, and it's not really incompleteness in the sense of they're so ambitious that they're insatiable or something, or something kind of like this, or something Lacanian, like they're incomplete because their desire is always never completely fulfilled, or something kind of dramatic like that. It's not a dramatic incompleteness. It's a it's a kind of um it's a kind of clumsy, awkward, and almost somewhat childlike incompleteness, because the description here almost does seem like he's describing someone who's wearing, like if you see like a kid wears dad's clothes, or something, like a child wear the clothes of an adult, or he's like dressing up in a costume or something. Like there's a kind of costume wearing description going on here, um, which is interesting because you do see this issue. This is something I've observed as well in our time, is that, although our time is getting a bit crazy now, so our time is kind of re-entering less of a peaceful, stable period. But the time period we've lived in since the end of World War II up to now is that, when you have these periods of a lot of knowledge, a lot of science, a lot of knowledge, a lot of affluence, but there's not a lot of interesting things going on. It's not a lot of like what you would call typically historical activity, historical struggle, and great creations. People are creating a new religion or a new culture, or some glorious historical battle or conquest is going on, or something like this, when there's not a lot going on and people are very comfortable and protected, but they've also got a lot of knowledge, and they're kind of borrowing from different things the whole time. They're borrowing from different cultures and different places and different times, trying to sort of clumsily conjure up an identity for themselves. They do appear a little bit, sometimes a little bit childlike, which is ironic because we think of ourselves as being mature because we have more knowledge than other people. But we actually do appear childlike, I think, a lot of the time. And I see this completely today. I've seen this, it's not just today, but I've seen this throughout my lifetime anyway, that a lot of the people that are supposed to be sort of mature or enlightened or something like this, they almost look like they're wearing someone else's clothes the whole time, and they seem awkward in that persona, and they seem unfitting towards it, if that makes sense, incongruous. Somebody once pointed out to me that Bill Gates Bill Gates looks like Bill Gates dresses like a mother would dress a little boy. Like his jumpers are like too big for him, you know, and he looks like he looks like a little boy who's been dressed by his mother with the clothes of an older brother or something like this. He looks like he doesn't fit in his own clothes. But this is the incongruity of our time. When a time lacks a kind of fundamental activity or capacity for creativity, and it's very educated and enlightened affluent, and it borrows, and it wears other people's clothes, and it comes. And these descriptions in Nietzsche, are very are very good, because they sort of draw up this persona of the last man. I talked about this recently with an essay talking about the blink. The last man believes he's found happiness, he invented happiness, and he blinks. I was talking about, well, what is this blinking gesture? What is this about? And I was talking about the sort of self satisfaction of the kind of ease and self satisfaction of blinking. It's almost like blinking is like digesting, or your body oxygenating itself. It's not even like an activity. It's an activity. It's like a gesture which is like so easy and so quick. And you get a lot out of this kind of persona of the last man, this sort of character, this incongruity, this peculiarity to him. This sort of almost kind of theatrical imagery of the last man is very important, actually. People often overlook this, overlook these little peculiarities. But here again, we have something more concrete. He's kind of someone who borrows and borrows and wears other people's clothes, and he conjures together this. Another example I'm thinking here of is I was watching that film. What is it? Forgetting Sarah Marshall and Russell Brand, and I actually quite like Russell Brand. A lot of people don't like him. I think he's quite an interesting person, but he is someone who's attempted to sort of conjure up an identity out of various different kind of components. I mean, he's always like, I mean, his latest thing is he's a Christian now. He's a Catholic, and he's kind of gone through different phases of being a kind of rock star and a kind of hippie, a kind of yoga guru hippie kind of all this stuff, right? But there's this film, Forgetting Sarah Marshall, and he's in it, and he's dating this girl, and they have an argument, and she just starts insulting him, and she says, she's like looking at his tattoos, and she says to him, like, that's Hindu, that's Buddhist, that's that's pagan, that's this, that's that. Like, these are just a bunch of random crap that you've thrown together to conjure up yourself a personality. And this is very true. Like, this is sort of what people who have a lot of knowledge but not a lot of, let's say, historical activity or opportunity for activity do. They sort of clumsily conjure themselves a kind of a sort of identity. And there is something interesting here about form and content. I think okay. I'll talk about practice, theory and practice. Form and content, I think, is an important thing here. So Nietzsche has another passage where he says, let's see, where will I read from? Okay, I'll read from this whole thing. Generally, whoever sees it will recognize a holy need here. He tells himself, here it is necessary to give assistance, that higher unity in the nature and soul of the people must be established once more. That gulf between inner and outer must disappear again under the hammer blows of need. What means should he now reach for? What remains for him now other than his deep understanding? By speaking out on this and spreading awareness of it, by sowing from his full hands, he hopes to plant a seed, and out of the strong need will one day arise the strong deed. And so that I leave no doubt where I derived the example of that need, that necessity, that knowledge. Here is my testimony. Here my testimony should stand, that it is German unity in that highest sense which we are striving for, and more passionately for, than that of political reunification, the unity of the German spirit and life after the destruction of the opposition of formal content, the inner life and convention. So he's talking about a destruction between the Germans' inner life and their sort of outward expressions and their outward conventions. That they're still a reflexive and thoughtful people, and I think in Nietzsche's time, obviously it's interesting because a lot of people would consider this time to be this great time in German kind of culture, and also for the English as well, Victorian era. The French were a little bit earlier than that. They were more like the beginning of the 19th century. But you know, whoever, well, whatever time frame you want to put it, 19th century was in many ways like it had a lot of advances and successes in many ways for for these large European countries like France, Germany, England. Um, but like within this time, there seems to be a destruction of thought and action, inner life and convention, and Nietzsche's talking about this in the German context, obviously, because Germans are famously reflexive. So it's like he's kind of saying that reflexivity doesn't have anywhere to go. It doesn't have a sort of convention or a culture or an activity or an outward expression to sort of manifest itself and to make itself unified and whole and more complete and more fulfilled and more mature. It's sort of lacking that. And then I suppose what happens to that inwardness then once it doesn't have an expression? Well, that's a good question. But I wanted to draw an analogy here also to actually, interestingly enough, to Karl Marx, because Karl Marx, with his theories of alienation, was often a critique of the fact that we're working in a way in which the kind of theory and the praxis are separated, that we're alienated from our labor, our activity doesn't have a kind of holistic understanding of it, of itself. You know, like the blacksmith, for example, in the medieval setting, he sort of has a holistic understanding of what he's doing, you know, and he has a vocational relationship to his craft, and he has a holistic understanding of it. Where the man in the factory just he just puts together a few components and he puts it on this and he does that, and then the next guy does this and he does that, and the next guy does this and he does that, and there's a kind of disconnect. There's a kind of disconnect, and not to mention the commodification disconnect of the products of your labor. You're alienated from that. But there's these disconnects between our activity and our thought. And in Nietzsche's here context, he's saying it's between our thought and our convention, or our kind of outward expression. And the task here is a kind of unity between those two things. And that actually is something that kind of more radical thinkers of the 19th century were hinting towards a lot. A better unity between theory and practice, knowledge and convention. You see it in Marx, and you see it here in Nietzsche as well, that there's a real crisis about this. And I can sort of feel like this sort of the kind of anxiety there as being very relevant to our time, especially with digital technology, because we're sort of alienated from so many things because of digital technology. You know, we're sort of confused and alienated from from like holistic identities. Like if you think about the internet, like the capacity to just borrow stuff from everywhere all the time, globally, this global borrowing. It's not even a borrowing from historical cultures anymore. It's a kind of global borrowing of different ways of thinking, different tones, everything. It's this massive network of things you can borrow from, right? People are always borrowing, and they lack completeness. They lack wholeness. They lack something to give them form, something to make sense of all this information and all this communication. So again, there's something quite relevant to our time here. And actually, I just noticed that the next paragraph, because I didn't highlight it. I don't know why I didn't highlight it, but I should have. He's basically describing this very problem. So I'll read. He says, and now back to our first statement. Modern man suffers from a weakened personality. So modern man has a weakened personality. Exactly what I was saying earlier. Like, just as the Roman in the time of the Caesars became un-Roman with regards to the area of the earth standing at his disposal, this big empire, as he lost himself among the foreigners streaming in and degenerated with the cosmopolitan carnival of gods, customs, and arts, so matters must go with the modern person who continually allows his historical artists to prepare the celebration of a world market fair. He has become a spectator, enjoying and wandering around, converted into a condition in which even great wars and huge revolutions are hardly able to change anything momentarily. Okay, it's incredibly relevant to how things have been, I think, in the early 21st century and maybe late 20th century to a degree as well. Um, so he's describing here this sort of Roman who has this big empire, and he's got all this, he does this kind of exotic things streaming in from the edges of the empire, food from different places like Egypt, or who knows, different fashion trends, maybe different sort of different kind of religious cults or philosophies or something like this, sort of streaming in from all these places, and he can sort of indulge himself in all these exotics, and he can kind of walk around the market of exotic peculiarities. It's kind of product of globalization. Um, but in this he's been completely reduced to a spectator. He's been completely reduced to kind of passive, as we would say today, a passive consumer of these identities, and he's cobbling them together, obviously, to try and make himself a personality out of it. It's incredibly similar description uh, of what we've experienced with globalization, the American model of globalization in particular, and it's kind of and actually I did an essay recently on Woodstock '99 documentary, and I was comparing the hippies to this kind of new metal scene, and something I noticed about the hippies was that they kind of wanted to fill in a sense of blandness or superficiality, which they had inherited from this kind of post-war 50s, kind of suburban, kind of milk toast Protestant middle class Christianity, suburbia, whatever. And the hippies actually borrowed from India a lot, right? So a lot of them went to India, and they spent some time there, did some meditating. Yoga became a kind of cultural peculiarity, which we were borrowed from Eastern kind of spirituality, New Age spirituality. So you see within the 60s kind of post-war period, when there was an expanse of Western sort of through the Americans in particular, there was a kind of expanse of Western um, uh, influence around the world, and people could travel more easily, and more tourism culture, kind of, and actually this is kind of similar to the 19th century in many ways, because there was a period of colonialism in the 19th century, and a lot of people who were more educated or wealthy could sort of go into Africa or go to India or go to these places in South America, and they could bring back all sorts of peculiar exotic artifacts and fashion trends with them, and ideas maybe sometimes. So there's a kind of globalization situation where people are borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. Um, but they end up within this borrowing, kind of like consumers walking through a market of cultural peculiarities. They're not really sort of fundamentally living that thing or engaged with it. It becomes a kind of superficial fashion trend, a costume, basically. So I'll keep reading. This is another interesting paragraph that I took a note of. That means here only into the piled up mass of scholarly data, which does not work towards the outside, instruction which does not become living. If we look for a moment out to the exterior, then we notice how the expulsion of instinct by history has converted people almost into nothing but abstractions and shadows. A man no longer gambles his identity on that instinct. Instead, he masks himself as educated man, a scholar, a poet, a politician. And then later on, slightly later on, he says, historical education and the common uniform of the middle class together both rule. While never before has there been such erroneous talk of the free personality, we never once see personalities, to say nothing of free people, but only anxiously disguised universal people. Okay, so it's an interesting statement there. We never see we never once see personalities to say nothing of free people, but only anxiously disguised universal people. So there's a universalization issue here. Um, so we could say the more we've universalized ourselves as Europeans or as Westerners, um, the more we sort of at the same time seek out um, these sort of additional markers of identity, to sort of fill in the void. This kind of exotic marketplace of artifacts, and costumes, which the buildup of knowledge, because it's an interesting sort of thought experiment. Because I mean, if you go to the Greeks, and they didn't have a whole lot of history, they had some knowledge of like of Bronze Age warfare through Homer, um, but it wasn't really history in the concrete sense. It was more like it was more mythology, but what I'm trying to say is, if you go back to a time where people don't have a lot of reference points, they're sort of just stuck people as people. Like, okay, we know we're Greeks, and we know over there there's Egyptians, and over there there's Macedonians, and over there there's um the whatever, like they got some really kind of very minimal basic sort of like reference points to their own history and their own geographical existence in the world, and it's kind of very basic, and they don't have like a whole lot of like, they don't have like libraries and libraries and libraries of built up knowledge and like, you know hundreds of years of science, obviously scientific data, they don't have like a lot of knowledge at their fingertips. They're kind of engaging through the world in a sort of not in a sort of in a much leaner position towards knowledge. Like, they have a much more minimal and leaner sort of strata of knowledge to sort of to live by, and understand themselves by. They're sort of in some sense privileged because of that, right? They're in some sense sort of able to sort of, as Nietzsche says, gamble on their instinct. They're able to sort of live closer to an instinct, or like attach their culture that they form, or the formation of a culture based closer to an instinct. It's nearer to them. It's more immediate. And they have less reference points. They have less sort of books they can look up to see what this person did at this time, and they have less. Obviously, they don't have this large, particularly the Greeks didn't have like. Although it kind of changed a bit with Alexander, you had the influence of Eastern, cultures and peoples in the Hellenic kind of empire, but still, like, this excess of borrowing from different peoples and different time periods, it is there's something about it which either causes or is a symptom of the incapacity for people to be moved by their instinct and to sort of relate to culture on a level which is closer to their instinct. There's so many layers of kind of obfuscation, because I suppose what culture does in some sense is it mediates us. It sort of mediates us as people to life. It gives us a sort of form, or a stylization of living, in which the world, in its sort of pure sense of just the world, is given a style, a character, a form, and that's obviously good and necessary. And there's no way Nietzsche's arguing that we shouldn't have that. It's just that it seems to me that, like, the kind of so nature of culture can be different, in the sense that it can be a closer expression of instinct, or allow you to express your instinct closer, or can really distance you from it. And the problem with these kind of advanced, universalized, globalized cultures and societies, that it kind of creates a bigger and bigger distance. The culture kind of slowly pushes you away from life, pushes you away from instinct, pushes you away from activity and immediacy. Now obviously technology does this too. If you think about like technology, in many ways, it kind of pushes the world away from us. Um, Makes us safer and you know less vulnerable, makes life less threatening in some sense. Um, but I suppose what Nietzsche's saying here is that culture can do that as well. Like culture can, this particular sort of culture, a kind of advanced, knowledgeable, universalized, globalized culture, can create a lot of obfuscations and distances from instinct, from immediacy, from living. Obviously, the stuff we need to live, to be grounded in reality and to create, obviously, as well.
Okay, so next we're going to get into Nietzsche's critique of objectivity, like scientific objectivity of um, of history, like objective scientific view of history. Is this possible? What's the reasoning behind this, and so on? So I'll just read this. I suppose impartiality would be another way to put it. I'll just read this quote anyway, and then discuss. So he says, those naive historians call objectivity the process of measuring past opinions and deeds by the universal public of the moment. Here they find a canon of all truths. Their work is to adapt the past to contemporary triviality. By contrast, they call subjective that way of writing history which does not take popular opinion as canonical, and might not an illusion have occurred in the highest interpretation of the word objectivity. With this word, people understand a condition in the historian in which he looks at the event with such purity in all motives and consequences that they find no effect at all on his subject. Okay, so yeah, this is this critique of the possibility of a kind of objective or um, impartial view of history. And yeah, this is important from a very Nietzschean perspective, not just as a sort of critique of the capacity to be objective in viewing history, because of course there's standards of objectivity everywhere, like journalism and history, to name two examples, are dealing with things in which it's kind of difficult to always be completely objective 100%, but there are standards in which maybe you can be evidently more objective in some way than in one way than in another way. Like there are clearly standards of objectivity in a practice such as history or journalism, particularly when there's facts involved. You're dealing with something basically when there's facts, but there's also values involved, and then there's a kind of need to separate those two things and to make sure your facts are leading the way, and so on and so on, right? But I suppose Nietzsche's critique here is that I suppose it's a question of okay, so basically history is two things. It's reading and learning about facts, like the facts of what happened here, there, and so on, and historians dispute these facts. But this isn't what Nietzsche's talking about. He's more concerned in the subjectivity. I mean, this is really a study of subjectivity. Like if we're critiquing the last man and the end of history in this, we're critiquing historical subjectivity. We're looking at historical character and historical subjectivity, and that's exactly what Nietzsche's critiquing here. He's describing and critiquing the character of the last man, and the last man is a historical subject. He's sort of the death of historical subjectivity, but he's also a historical subject at the same time. So, and this leads to basically a critique of what we would call, in more contemporary times, presentism, which means the tendency to always adopt the values and attitudes of the present, and to sort of, I suppose, assume those are universal or superior, just de facto, because we're in the present. The present is always superior. Again, a very, very strong tendency among the scientifically educated moderns. It's a very strong flaw. It's a very prescient flaw in the in the scientifically educated moderns. We tend to take up this motif of, or not motif, I suppose it is a thing. This kind of exponentiality, this exponential growth in knowledge, which people apply to technology, for example, science and technology. The more time goes on, the more knowledge we have, and there's an exponential development of technology because of that. You can argue with that if you want, but that makes, I suppose, more sense if you're just talking about the mere bare capacity to do technology. But when we're dealing with history, we're not dealing with something that's material. We're not dealing with purely material. We're dealing with something which is facts and subjectivity, and it's the study of subjectivity. It's the study of historical subjectivity, like not just where did the ancient Greeks live, and what did they eat, and what did they say, and what happened here and there, and all this, but like what dates were those, and yeah, but their subjectivity, their spirits, like what they really thought about things, how they really felt about things, what they really believed in, whether or not they considered something morally good or bad, whether or not they of course there's anthropological questions also about, for example, did you see these controversies with things like, did the Vikings have women in their armies or something like this? Or was there just one woman one time who died with a sword because she was defending herself, because maybe she picked up a sword and someone was attacking her? Does that mean she's like a warrior, and then Netflix can make a show about warrior princess Vikings, and you can have Beyonce or somebody, dressed up as a Viking kicking ass, right? Because this is actually a good place to explicate this issue is to look at TV shows, because TV shows and movies are not trying to give you historical facts. But they will sort of play on historical realities and facts, and they will hire historians and so forth and so on to sort of help them create a kind of period piece. But we might take one little historical fact. So, for example, take the Viking issue. Though, there was female Vikings fighting, and someone once found, a woman, a skeleton with buried with a sword, and along other belongings, and they took that to mean, they took that basically as an excuse to sort of say, the Vikings were actually feminists, So this is a good example of presentism. It's like they're looking for little details to sort of verify their present attitude. And what Nietzsche's, I think, critiquing here is the distinction of historical peoples, the way they live, the way they think, the way they feel, what they believed in, and so forth, is peculiar and foreign to us, and that peculiarity and foreignness is not necessarily a bad thing, right? If you're a very progressively minded person, you probably do think it's a bad thing. But there you go. I mean, it's really not something which we have a completely impartial space to occupy in our study of history, in that sense. That yes, there are objective facts and objective facts, but a study of the subjectivity of historical peoples is something which needs to include into it an understanding of our own subjectivity. And this is, again, the sort of self-critique aspect, I would say. The last man doesn't have a capacity to self-critique, to see himself as part of the picture. He's a kind of scientifically minded person, insofar that science tends to take the scientist out of the equation and sort of say, this is the world, and we're going to understand it objectively, but it doesn't include its own subjectivity into that understanding. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily need to. Like if you want to figure out some very, very, very concrete facts, but you see how facts can be easily intertwined with a kind of peculiar desire to see ourselves as similar to history, or to see history as similar to us. Um, that issue with distinct historical subjectivity is an issue which forces us to think about our own flaws. Basically, like, we're too arrogant. The reason we wanted to interpret that this sword that was found with this grave is because we want to pretend that that the way we think and do things is normal and universal and good. Maybe we know it's not. we're trying to justify it. Like, there's a kind of a psychoanalytical aspect to this as well. And I think generally philosophers are better for this than other people, including even psychologists, because philosophers, just by the fact that the ancient Greeks are like such a pillar stone in the whole practice of philosophy and the whole the whole field of philosophy, sort of makes it difficult for us to take an overly presentist attitude. I mean, some people still do it. Some philosophers still do it, but it makes it more difficult because you have to then incorporate, why were these bloody Greeks so clever? They didn't have all the knowledge we have, the technology we have. They didn't have all the science we have. They didn't have the morals that we have. They didn't even have Christianity, let alone like modern liberal values. So like how are they so again, and this is one of the things which is motivating Nietzsche here as well. I do think a lot of modern philosophy, like good modern philosophy, is basically kind of implicitly always asking the question, like, how are they so smart? They were so different to us, and we think we're smart. What's going on here? Explain this difference. Explain what's happening here. Like, this is this kind of anxiety here of explain that. I think that's motivating a lot of philosophy, modern philosophy, at least good modern philosophy. So this is an important issue, and like, this is where some people would lump in Nietzsche with a kind of vulgar postmodernism, and it's completely wrong to do that. Like, this is objective. Like, it's objectively wrong to do that, because he's not saying, he's not declaring a kind of postmodern attitude in the simple sense of like, well, I think that, again, it kind of depends how you define postmodernism, but the point is here that he's simply like, he's not saying that we can't formulate an objective understanding of historical facts, just facts. What he's saying is that embedded in history itself, but embedded not just in the study of history, the very bloody existence of history, the very thing that exists, that we're acknowledging exists in the study of it, is not just facts. It involves this sort of, it involves a realm of subjectivity, and therefore an objective, like, you would have to therefore claim that an objective study of historical subjectivity is possible through these facts, or that merely us, like scientists, purely learning these facts gives us the right to claim we understand the subjectivity of others, and therefore the distinction between us and them. That's what he's saying you can't do. So can you? The question is then, can you do it? Like, is it possible to do this? And he sort of does here. I'm going to read out a short little paragraph. He does sort of suggest that it is that a study of history in the totality of understanding a different historical subjectivity is sort of possible, but it takes a certain character and a certain spirit, we could say, to do it. So he says you can interpret the past only on the basis of the highest power of the present. Only in the strongest tension of your noblest characteristics will you surmise what from the past is great and worth knowing and preserving, like by like. Otherwise, you will reduce the past down to your level. So it is, of course, it's not completely invaluable to do history, to study history, but it requires a kind of strong character, a kind of noble characteristic, and of course that's not good enough. It's like what do you mean by that? What's a noble character is okay. So of course, like he doesn't really give us like a concrete sort of identification of who can study history or who or what kind of person and in exactly what way that study will be beneficial. He doesn't give us that, but he does basically say that there is the task of studying history correctly is more than just whether or not you're good at learning facts. Basically, it means that you're not going to have this issue. I mean, to begin with, you're not going to have the issue of reducing the past down to your level. You're not going to have a presentism problem. And beyond that, you also probably need to be a kind of person who has some sort of noble characteristic. So really, studying history is more importantly a kind of question of temperament and a question of character and virtue. It's not purely a question of whether or not you're good at learning dates or not. And again, he does indicate a little bit more information about who should be studying history. Then he says, it is appropriate now to understand that only the man who builds the future has the right to judge the past. So when he's saying judging the past, he basically means, and this translation might be a bit misleading because we think in English we tend to think that means like condemn, like morally condemn. He's not saying morally condemn. It means judge in a more neutral sense, like to sort of observe the past, a certain people in the past, a certain time, and kind of see if there's anything in it that is valuable or more valuable than something else or more worth something than anything else. So the judgment here is not necessarily negative. It's kind of positive and negative. But anyway, okay. It is appropriate now to understand that the only man who builds the future has the right to judge the past. In order to look ahead, set yourselves an important goal, and at the same time control that voluptuous analytical drive which you now lay waste at the present and render almost impossible all tranquility, all peaceful growth and maturing. So yeah, you need to control this analytical instinct which moderns have, and there's a kind of self-disciplinary thing there, and it's not the self-discipline of like controlling your emotions or your drives, your instincts or your impulses. It's controlling your analytical, rational mind. And also with a will to a future. Without a will to a future, I suppose Nietzsche is saying there isn't much point in studying history. Like history sort of is bound to an imagination or a will or a directionality towards the future. And if you don't have that, then what's the point, I suppose, is kind of what he's saying.
Also, a really interesting and unexplored area of thought here, which I'm more drawn to, which is the question of art as a kind of supplement to history. I'm not talking about art history, which to me just sounds like the most boring genre of study humanly possible. But both because I hate museums and because I don't find most paintings particularly interesting. And they always obsess over paintings when they talk about art history. Like they'll never talk about Greek tragedies or like the gladiator arena. Why isn't the gladiator arena its performance? Why isn't that art? Why can't I talk about Korn, the new metal band? It's always like, oh, this painting, and then you look at a slideshow of an image. You look at an image of an image, an image of an image of an image. It's horrible. Nothing. We're not talking about art history. We're talking about art as a kind of supplement to history to help deal with the, I suppose, intersubjective task of understanding the past intersubjectively, and of course not being arrogant in doing so and not presuming superiority or not. Anyway, he says. So this is after a paragraph where he says history is so full of violence, and what did he say? He said the reason for this is that the historical method of reckoning. The reason for this is that in the historical method of reckoning, so many false crude, inhuman, absurd, and violent things, always emerges that the fully pious atmosphere of illusion is one in which alone everything that wants to live can necessarily to live can live necessarily disappears. Okay, so basically um there's a kind of I suppose a kind of smothering, maybe a kind of reductiveness, a reduction, and a smothering of history when we try to understand it in this very analytical way. And I mean, you do see, I suppose, our time's a bit different to Nietzsche's time in this, insofar as that Nietzsche's time, I feel, was trying to stick more stringently to objective historical education, whereas our time does that, but it also adds in this sort of, is kind of what Nietzsche's warning about here. Kind of adds in this like moralistic humanitarian supplement. You know, have you ever like been like watching a documentary about something in the past, and then they have to inform you that this was bad. You know, they have to sort of give like a moral warning, trigger warning. You know, this was bad, and it's just it's like I suppose it kind of contains this contradiction. A good example of this is actually in the British Imperial War Museum. If you're ever in London and you've got a few hours to kill, go check out the Imperial War Museum. Not only because, as far as museums go, I hate museums. You know, you could destroy all the museums with bombs. And okay, I can't see that on YouTube. Don't do that. But if one wanted to legally get rid of all these museums, I would be perfectly fine with it. Um, you know, but anyway, as far as museums go, it's a pretty interesting museum. But it's funny because the Imperial War Museum, has this really funny contradiction everywhere, every single museum artifact, and it's got loads of this sort of, it's got a lot of like multimedia, you know, kind of process. You know, for example, like World War One, there's a lot of like the rooms are all painted and with murals, and it looks like you're in a trench, and they're trying to invoke the imagery of World War One, and then they give you headphones, for example, and you can listen to like what it would sound like, and then you know, and then you're looking at some of the weapons equipments and the shells and all the weapon sizes and stuff. So it's like it's, you know, it's like they try to immerse you basically in it. And at the same time, of course, because it's the Imperial War Museum in London, you know, it's kind of pompous, you know, it's kind of like, oh, when we ruled the seven seas, like it has this sort of tone to it, but at the same time, it's trying to tell you that war is bad. So it's like, you know, it's like, hey, look at all these cool weapons, and do you remember when we were in charge? Oh, but war is bad. You shouldn't do war. Shouldn't do war. Like it's kind of convoluted. It's really convoluted. I always thought it's like, well, you know, make your mind up. You know, another example of this is actually the Napoleon film. The Napoleon film is a good educational watch to see everything Nietzsche is warning us about in this essay in a piece of cinema. Right, it's everything. It's presentism, trying to understand Napoleon basically as this kind of weird, pervy, stupid, incompetent person, as basically trying to recreate our own characteristics, our own contemporary characteristics, and universalize those, and even say, oh, some of the greatest men who have ever lived are nothing more than us. We are the greatest people ever. This is what the last man thinks, of course, and he blinks. And but at the very end of the film, even if the film was good, it wasn't. It was terrible. But even at the end, even if it was good, the very end of the film, they have this sort of credits, and it's like, oh, this is how many people died in the Napoleonic Wars, and then it gives you like whatever amount of people, whoever it was, like actually not very much compared to World War One or World War Two. It should be noted. I'm not even so sure it was as much as the Caesar's campaign in Gaul. I'm not sure how many people died in or Caesar's campaigns in general. I'm not. You know, the Gallic Wars. I don't know. I would imagine actually the number was probably quite similar. But mean, look it up, you know. But anyway, the point is they try to give you these numbers because it's like just in case you watch this and you felt, you know, inspired by a great man, even though they spent the whole film trying to pretend he wasn't a great man. Just in case you felt inspired by a great man to do anything other than like consume and work in an office all day. By the way, this is how many people died. So like moral trigger warning, moral condemnation at the end of the film. So it's like it's like so like this is kind of I think what he's talking about here. Like this how did he put it? This process the reason is the method is it, the reckoning of so many false, crude, inhuman, absurd, and violent things. Again, like history has this sort of process of moral reckoning and of in Hegelian terms kind of reconciliation. We know things about the past that were kind of bad or at least morally ambiguous, and we sort of live in the aftermath of those events, or we're the ancestors of those people, and we live in a kind of civilization maybe that they informed or that they imprinted themselves upon or something. We kind of live in their world to some mysterious in some mysterious extent, whether or not you put that spiritually, politically, technologically, or genetically, obviously with ancestors. And there's an urge then to kind of reconcile with that, and one of the things that we do here is a kind of stupid stupid mechanisms of reconciliation, basically. And it is really in a kind of in the category of art, which this reconciliation happens. I think it's really more through art which happens, and you see this in museums, because museums often do, even historical museums often do sort of present a kind of immersive situation. If you go to the Titanic Museum in Belfast, for example, it's not very good, but it's interesting again just to go. I know for someone who hates museums, I've been to a lot of museums, but if you go, I kind of it's like hate watching, you know, a bad film or something. It's like I kind of go just to hate, but the Titanic Museum has a lot of like immersive, like, what would it be like to be there? And it plays up all the multimedia technologies of our time. And I think there's even like a roller coaster ride, like a mini roller coaster ride, where like they put you on a kind of roller coaster carriage thing, and it pushes you along, and you go into this you go on this ride, and it's blah blah blah. It's very immersive, like, and there is an attempt to reconcile ourselves with the catastrophe or the moral ambiguity or the suffering and struggling or whatever of that past time and that past situation and event. And it's really interesting, more artistic and less factual, which this comes about. I think Nietzsche here was a little bit more optimistic that this would be his time again was so kind of rational and trying to stick to this objective rationality. I mean, like, cinema wasn't a big thing in Nietzsche's time, obviously, late 19th century. Roller coasters, a roller coaster ride through a Titanic museum wasn't a thing in Nietzsche's time, where you got all the multimedia, the screens and the immersive audio-visual technologies going around you and go, this is what it would be like to be in the Titanic, and all the screams and the horrors and he didn't have a kind of audio-visual cinematic understanding of a supplement to historical education, which we now do. So I think Nietzsche was probably a little bit more optimistic about this in his time. This could be used, and I think it can be used well. Like, it can be, but it can also be used badly. It can also be used really badly. The Napoleon film is a good example of that. But it brings up an interesting question of the role art can play in this process of historical education. So he says, in effects like this, history is opposed to art, and only when history takes it upon itself to turn itself into an artwork and thus to become a purely artistic picture, can it perhaps maintain the instincts or even arouse them? Such historical writing, however, would thoroughly go against the analytical and inartistic trends of our time. Indeed, they would consider a counterfeit. So again, like he's sort of arguing for more artistic supplements to our study of our study of history. Yeah, obviously, this is probably a good thing to do, but it should be noted that we have we have extremely stupid versions of that in our time.
Okay, so again, as a description of the last man, and this has never been described properly. We kind of get this kind of cookie cutter description of him in kind of popular culture. Although, actually, if you went up to the average person on the street and said, "Who's the last man?" I actually think like 80, if not 90% of people wouldn't know what you're talking about. So it's not even like the last man is a greatly popularized image. I mean, compared to some aspects of philosophy that have, I go up and ask someone who Richard Dawkins is, and most people today will tell you who that is, but go talk about the last man, no one will, 10-20% will know who you're talking about. So there's already a problem there to begin with. But one of the big failings of Nietzschean scholarship or Nietzschean commentators or Nietzscheans is really that like no one's put a lot of effort into articulating what the last man is, who the last man is. And I think this is one of the interesting things about the moment at the end of history, and Fukuyama and Mark Fisher and things which revolve around history, because actually it's really a discussion of history where you get a nuanced explication of the last man. You have to go through history, really. The typical kind of cheap sort of like pop psychology, you could say, description of the last man is like, someone's just kind of lazy, doesn't have any ambition, and maybe they just seek safety and comfort. It kind of crosses over into Agamben's theory of bare life a little bit. That's an extremely important crossover, because I think you have to take technology and biopolitics into account too. But even that hasn't been explicated well. But I think, and in these days, I suppose with things like transhumanism and lockdowns in the pod and that cartoon Wall-E, where they show where these like over obese humans are being shipped around in a kind of luxury space station, being fed and entertained, titillated. You do sometimes get like kind of technological situations which bring out the character of the last man and attempts to describe the last man. I think, for example, Wall-E is a good example of a kind of last man figure. Those people on that spaceship are last men, quite literally, actually, because the world had died and ended, and they were the last ones. You get some other descriptions of last men, like for example, in that movie which Mark Fisher talked about. What's it called? Clive Owen. People can't reproduce anymore, and there's like one girl who's pregnant, and they're trying to figure it. They're trying to save her. People are trying to attack her. So the world's ending because no one can reproduce, and there's a kind of end. There's a last man theme to that. It's kind of biopolitical, or like demographics and birth gaps and all that kind of stuff. But like there has been sort of explications and attempts to describe and characterize and depict and act out the kind of true nature character of the last man. Fight Club is a good example. I think Fight Club is probably the best example in cinema. Although you kind of, like the Ubermensch figure of Tyler Durden sort of takes over, and we sort of, the film sort of centers around him more than Edward Norton, who's the last man figure. So there's a split here in the subjectivity, the last man and the Ubermensch, in which Fight Club is very, very good at describing. But there's still just not enough. There's just not enough attempts, whether through cinema or whether through just writing or whether through whatever, music, anything, just to touch upon the true nature of the last man and his character. And here anyway we get something which is worth taking into account. Okay, so we're going to read again some passages. He says, "For the most powerful people, that is, powerful in deeds and works, have lived very differently and have raised their young people differently. But that folly and that superstition suits us. So runs the skeptical objection, us, the latecomers, the faded last shoots of a more powerful and more happily courageous generations, us in whom one can see realized Herod's prophecy that one day people would be born with instant grey beards, and that Zeus would destroy this generation as soon as that sign became visible to him. Historical culture is really a kind of congenital grey-haired condition, and those who bear its mark from childhood on would have to come to the instinctive belief in the old age of humanity. An old person's occupation, however, is appropriate to old age. That is, looking back, tallying the accounts, balancing the books, seeing consolation in what used to be through memories, in short, historical culture." Okay, end quote. This is a really, really good paragraph. Born with grey beards. I think this would be a great title for a book about last men and the caricature of last men. This is one of the many characteristics that we should be trying to describe in The Last Man, is to do with age and to do with, I suppose you could say, right, in some simple kind of almost psychoanalytical observation, that we sort of have an ego ideal, or that we sort of identify and model ourselves. We could get into Norbert Elias's theories on character formation here if you want, but we sort of model ourselves on something, and that something is obviously existed before us in the society. It's a part of our society, and we're identifying with something, some ideal within the society, and we sort of develop a character or personality through our time. So when we exist in a civilization, let's say, that's in what Spengler would call the winter phase, or at least the autumn phase, perhaps the winter phase, when we exist within a civilization that has a lot of historical memory, and let's say it's late in the Enlightenment, for example, the late 19th century, late in the Enlightenment, it's existing within an epoch at the end of a certain epoch, that it affects the way people are. Like, just because they're born and then they grow old and they die doesn't mean like everyone's gonna have like the same concept of youth or being old or being middle-aged as the last epoch or the last generation. Like, things will shift around. So like, and this is a point actually which Strauss and is it Howe? I can't remember the other guy's name, but Strauss and another guy wrote this book, Generations, or no, The Fourth Turning, and it's about the effect basically of generational cycles through history, and it takes this schema of kind of Spenglerian schema of spring, winter, spring, summer, autumn, winter, and one thing he points out in that book is that like the generation that are born at the beginning of a summer phase in one of these cycles is gonna because it's experiencing its childhood in a summer phase. It's gonna be a very its character, its way of thinking and behaving is gonna be very different to a generation which is born, let's say, in the beginning of a winter phase, and which is basically like in our time like boomers versus zoomers. It's basically or younger millennials even, like it's basically that schism. So there's a kind of if we want to study subjectivity and historical subjectivity, that's what we're doing. We're looking at the last man. We're looking at an expression of historical subjectivity, or perhaps we're looking at the failure to develop historical subjectivity. But that itself is still historical. So yeah, look, it's important to sort of bring out the fact that people that are growing up, let's say, in a kind of tired, weary late stage of a certain epochal cycle, we can say, are going to be at risk to certain tendencies. And one of those is that they are going to, I suppose, develop the characteristics of the elderly at quite a young age. And this is something I've even noticed today, that like people are kind of a bit frail and neurotic and a bit antisocial and a bit grumpy. I'm a bit of a grumpy person in general, but like I find that's just because I'm kind of an elitist person more than like an elderly. Yeah, but I do see this to a certain extent, like the way in which like youthful, we could say kind of youthful subculture has adapted in the past like 10 to 15 years does to me seem a little bit like it's a bit senile or something. It's sclerotic, it's senile, it's sort of characteristics of the elderly, right? People born with gray beards, they're sort of skipping, we could say they're skipping from like, let's say like 22 to 58 in like 1 year. And I've noticed that. I've really noticed that with people, especially when they get into like a couple and they live together, and they have an office job. If a contemporary Western man is like 28 and he lives with a girlfriend and he works in an office, it's almost like he immediately goes into retirement. It's straight away, bang. And you notice, I don't know, certain characteristics or even kind of aspects of physiology. So like I guess what this shows is like a kind of misuse of youth. The youth here is being misused. There's a certain opportunity of youth is being misused. And that there's an over-identification of with the elderly at a young age, and a lack of distinction, I would say, also between the elderly and the young. They kind of get glooped in together, in one big bracket. A kind of generational androgyny, we could even say. And it's I think what Nietzsche is trying to describe here is this is a symptom of knowledge. This is a symptom of historical culture. This is a symptom of the same problem where we collect and collect and collect knowledge, and we have all this knowledge of history, but we don't really know what to do with it. We don't use it properly, and it sort of overwhelms us, suffocates us, smothers us, and one of the consequences of that is that we sort of spend our time, as he says, tallying the accounts, balancing the books, trying to find consolation in what used to be through memories. In short, historical culture, we sort of constantly looking back and trying to reconcile and tally the accounts and remember things. And I guess nostalgia, for example, is one of the symptoms of this, because it's kind of typical for old people to have nostalgia. It's entirely appropriate, actually, for old people to have nostalgia at the end of their life. You'll notice like the nostalgia of like I'm 31, like people my age will be nostalgic. Like, oh, do you remember when when we were young and we did this and that? And it's not just an age thing. It's like something's happened to the society, which is just this sort. It's just, it doesn't make sense anymore. It's died. Its kind of spirit has died, and we're sort of looking back into like the little burst of fun and kind of culture and transgression or whatever that we experience kind of at the very tail end of the kind of post-war subcultural era, you know. People are very hasty to be nostalgic today. They're very hasty to sort of look back and reminisce instead of looking forward, or instead of kind of being visionary in some sense. And this happens I do think this is happening at an increasingly young age. It's almost like, and I've also noticed this tendency with the Zoomers. Now I'm sorry if you're a Zoomer and I'm going to offend you here, but I've noticed, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, because it could be a sort of reaction to the Gen Xers and the Boomers who want to pretend that they're 26 when they're like fucking 70 or something. Like it could be a bit of a resistance to sort of this kind of forever youthfulness, this very kind of cliched forever youthfulness of like the Boomers. But I've noticed, like, I've met a lot of Zoomers who are maybe like intellectually curious about, you know, philosophy and things like that, and they will dress like old people. Like I saw a tweet once, and it was like it was a picture of like Zoomer era sort of like political people within like the political commentary kind of, let's say, space, and people who are doing like, you know, online philosophy, alternative kind of philosophy stuff, and it was like, why do they all dress like geography teachers, but they're all like 22? I thought that was quite funny, because I've noticed that too, you know, because I studied philosophy in a university for a few years, you know, a good while back, but I did have, like, you know, some people that I would interact with, and they were very nice, clever, you know, people that I was happy to talk to. But if they were Zoomers, there was a tendency of them often to sort of dress like I remember my grandfather dressing or something like that. So, there's a sort of a kind of character molding symptom we have within these wintry late historical, kind of over historicized, whatever you want to call it, points in historical civilization, when the character of an old person sort of just takes over the mind of the young, and, you know, that's one aspect to the sort of like character of the last man in general, because, you know, the last man is someone who knows everything. He kind of doesn't have experience of anything, but he knows everything. He doesn't have a kind of will to a future, but he sort of has a sort of prudent caution about his day-to-day life. He's kind of overregulated and overcautious in his day-to-day activity, because he knows so much about, as Fukuyama put in his own book about the end history and the last man, you know, the last man will look back on the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics, or between the Germans and the French, and it will say, well, aren't I so clever for not being like them? They're so silly for getting involved in these silly conflicts. And then you can put yourself on a pedestal because you know better. So it's a kind of disposition of knowing better, without the capacity for action, without the capacity for creativity, without the capacity for. And I'm not saying the people I went to college with don't have this capacity. I'm just saying I generally notice an elderly, a younger and younger sort of elderly disposition. But, you know, the kind of general character we're describing here is someone who knows better but can't act. Someone who has lots of, let's see, kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the past but can't imagine the future. Someone who is sort of who has become cautious because of the past, who hasn't been inspired by the past, we can say. And the next few paragraphs actually touch upon a problem, and I think you could describe or summarize this problem as a certain aspect of Christianity being inherited from us in the modern world, but another aspect of Christianity being rejected. So let me just, again, I'll read some sentences. The human race, however, is a tough and persistent thing and will not have its steps forward and backwards viewed according to millennia. Indeed, hardly according to hundreds of thousands of years. That is, it will not be viewed at all as a totality from the infinitely small point of an atomic individual person, Then what will a couple of thousand years signify, or put another way, the time period of 34 consecutive human lives, reckoned at 60 years each, so that we can speak of the beginning of such a time as still the youth of mankind, and the end of it as the old age of mankind. Is it not much more the case that in this paralyzing belief in an already faded humanity, there sticks the misunderstanding of an idea of a Christian theology inherited from the Middle Ages, the idea of the imminent end of the world, of the nervously awaited judgment? Has this idea, in fact, changed through the infested need of history to judge, as if our time, the last of all possible, has been authorized to consider itself the universal judge of everything in the past? So, like you go and say, something which Christian belief awaits, not in any way from human beings, but from the Son of Man. In earlier times, this was for humanity as well. It's for the individual, a loud proclaimed memento mori, reminder of death, and always tormenting barb and, so to speak, the summit of medieval knowledge and conscience. Okay, so it's I suppose an eschatology which is always waiting for the end, and kind of very much focuses on the end, the end and the end times, and these end times, of course, bring a judgment. And I suppose from that perspective, the last man is someone who's bestowed the capacity to look back and judge. I suppose you could say there's something almost within that eschatology, that medieval eschatology, which is sort of which moves into our thought, our thinking, our history, our science, and it's through science and history that we sort of have this almost godlike perspective of the whole of everything, and we're allowed, of course, to indulge in a certain judgment that higher perspective has. Like, if you have more knowledge, more history, more historical facts, more knowledge, more scientific knowledge of the way things are, today than you did 500 years ago, there is a temptation with that perspective, with that increase in knowledge, to kind of put yourself in this kind of godlike position of judging the past, and and I suppose what that leaves out is like judging ourselves, right? Because that's exactly what the temptation is. It's like the scientific temptation is to judge, kind of have it's God's view. If we even say this word today, like God's view. If you have a view of, like, I don't know, an entire city, for example, from a drone or a hot air balloon, you have a God's view of an entire city. You see everything. You see the whole picture, whereas the people that are going about their daily lives are only seeing their little narrow historical frame, or certainly historical frame is a narrow, like, immediate frame of what they're experiencing. So for example, let's say there was an outbreak of a disease, and some people said, oh, it's because of this reason, but now in science shows us we really know it's this reason that it happened. Or there was a war which broke out between two different groups, and then we can sort of say, as the example I put earlier, we can say, well, they thought that it was good to do this, but we know in hindsight that the real reason this war happened was because the economy was bad here, or whatever, this territory was necessary here, but if they had just figured that out, they would have had whatever. You can hindsight your own sense of superiority, and in doing that, you leave out viewing yourself as part of this judgment. I think this is something something Zizek points out, not in reference to history necessarily, but or maybe it could be reference to history, but just in general, he says it in context of the kind of necessity of psychoanalysis. Basically, is that you have to put yourself in the perspective of the frame you're looking at. He uses a joke for this, which is, I think, a man comes home really drunk and his wife's cheating on him in bed, and he looks down and he says, normally I see 4 feet at the end of her bed, but now I see 6 feet. And she's like, oh, you're just drunk, go back to bed. Okay. So there's or like he sees 4 feet, but he sees like the 4 feet of his wife and the random man she's sleeping with. He doesn't see like himself included into it. So he doesn't understand that his wife's cheating on him. That's basically the point, right? He doesn't include himself into the frame. And if he did, he wouldn't have gotten cheated on, I suppose, is the message. So if you can't put yourself into the frame, you are you are kind of delusional. You're deranged. You're not getting closer to the truth. And actually, something very relevant to our time, which I was kind of hinting at earlier, and this crossover from the historical and the scientific and the sort of worship of experts, for example, and overvaluation and worship and dependence on science and scientific expertise, which isn't characteristic of last men, which has become more, I think, more not popular. What's the word? More recognized as of late. This is a very relevant passage in that context. So I'll read again. Only in a momentary forgetfulness, what that sense is intermittent, when that sense is intermittent, does the patient suffering from the hysterical fever become active, so that as soon as the action is over and done with, he may seize his deed through analytical consideration, prevent any further effects, and finally flay it for history. In this sense, we are still living in the Middle Ages, and history is always still this disguised theology, in exactly the same way that the reverence with which the unscientific laity treat the scientific caste is a reverence inherited from the clergy. What people in earlier times gave the church, people now give, although in scantier amounts, to science. Although in our time, I wouldn't say it's too scantier amounts, but still. Yeah. So it's an interesting claim he makes, which is that history is still a disguised theology. It's and again, I mean, this kind of basically does come back to this idea that scientists have a kind of godlike perspective. They can see the whole, they can see everything that we can't see. We're just caught into our little immediate sort of narrow frameworks of life and of existence, and they have this kind of greater perspective, and therefore they're kind of put into this godlike view, and people treat them with a lot of reverence for that reason. Like, I think it was very, very, very obvious during the pandemic, because people were like, there's this kind of invisible threat everywhere going around, and we don't really understand it, but the scientists understand it. Like, they can almost see a substance that we can't even see. We're walking around in a supermarket and we're thinking, oh my God, this thing is attacking us. This invisible threat, danger is attacking us. Where is it? And then we sort of have often a very false assumption that the scientific clergy, can see what we can't see. I think obviously they can explain things in a certain way that is a kind of scientific way of explaining things. I'm not saying that doesn't have any value to it, but it doesn't necessarily mean people can see things that everyone else can't see. And again, this is important because what Nietzsche wants us to do, in some sense, is to be sort of present within our lives. He wants us to be kind of immersed in our own time in history, our own lives, and participate in it. He doesn't want us to, kind of always try step outside of it to view everything from a sort of purely external perspective. And that's what the temptation of science is to step outside of life and view things as a kind of objective, a kind of external objective frame, you could say. So there's a bit of a rant here. Nietzsche goes on about Hegel and the world process, and he's sort of rejecting this, I suppose, this basic. I mean, this could be a superficial view of Hegel from Nietzsche's perspective. I'm sure Hegelians will disagree, because I think that, like, a lot of people that I know that are really like a really Hegel pilled, we could say, would probably agree with everything more or less that I've said so far. So it's sometimes I don't exactly know where the because I'm not that well read on Hegel yet, so I don't exactly know where the big contention between like Nietzsche and Hegel would be. But I suppose if you wanted to kind of have a cheap Hegelianism, a kind of poor man's Hegelianism, we could say a basic, I suppose, view that we're coming through this world historical process to a more and more truer, holistic, superior sort of perspective. We're becoming more, our consciousnesses are becoming more complete, you could say, and that we have a better view of everything, and therefore we're sort of more rational, or we're better at making judgments. We can judge better. We have the right to judge. All the things kind of Nietzsche's contesting. If that's your kind of Hegelianism, then I suppose, well, then obviously Nietzsche is against that. But I'm just to say that obviously, like, maybe Nietzsche didn't read Hegel thoroughly enough, or maybe he didn't. He's just using Hegel as a kind of a bit of a straw man to argue against, or he's talking about Hegelians rather than Hegel, for example. People often criticize Nietzsche from the same way. They kind of will, just purely like everything's will to power, everything's will to power, everything's will to power. These are Nietzscheans. They're not really Nietzsche. They don't really have a good reading of Nietzsche. They just focus on one thing from one cheap perspective, and these are Nietzscheans. And you will often hear people, they'll say, "Oh yeah, the Nietzschean view, that so and so and so," and it's not really Nietzschean. It's the Nietzscheans, not Nietzsche. So there's a difference between those two things. But anyway, just for argument's sake, let's take the kind of cheap version of Hegel and think about what Nietzsche is kind of arguing against. He says, historical considerations have never flown so far afield, not even in my dreams. For now, the history of human beings is only the continuation of the history of animals and plants. Indeed, even in the furthest depths of the sea, the historical universalist finds traces of himself, a living mucus. He gazes in astonishment, as if at a miracle, at the immense route which human beings have already passed through, and trembles at the sight of the even more astonishing miracle, modern man himself, who has the ability to survey this route. He stands high and proud on the pyramid of the world process, and he sets down on top of it the final stone of his knowledge. He appears to call out to nature, listening all around. We are the goal. We are the goal. We are the perfection of nature. And I wanted to sort of focus on that paragraph because obviously the famous tightrope walking Übermensch passage from Zarathustra. We have a man is not a goal, but he's a bridge. We are a crossing, a traversing, a passing, and not a goal in and of itself. And I suppose this is one of the risks of, call it the kind of cheap Hegel, or the progressive thinking, or the idea that the more knowledge we have, in this kind of enlightened sense, the more more of a kind of God's eye superior view we can look at the rest of the world from. You know, which is the increasing historical awareness and so on and so forth. That one of the risks of this exercise is to put man himself as a goal. Like knowing everything is like the goal. It's the perfection, I suppose, is another way you could put this. The goal is to know everything. It's to have a bird's eye view of everything. It's not to be immersed in anything. It's not to be within a particular context and perhaps not have a complete understanding of why you're doing it, but at the same time be able to live and be able to act and be able to sort of be admirable as well, because there's not really anything particularly admirable about, like, I suppose he's against knowing for the sake of knowing. Is another way you could put it. I mean, this is a kind of Nietzschean suspicion against there's just learning knowledge about the world without any sort of higher goal or praxis or developing the virtues necessary to handle that knowledge and not let that knowledge become a kind of force of nihilism and so on and so forth. The purely academic, kind of intellectual, scholarly, scientific, however you want to put it, exercise of knowing more and more things about history and scientific understandings of the way the physical world works and so on, is, in and of itself, is putting this kind of all-knowing, know-it-all man, the last man, in a position of the goal. He's the end point. It's all for him. like Alexander did a campaign in Asia so that some fucking nerd it's quite funny actually when you think about it like that, some nerd in Oxford or Massachusetts Institute of Technology or working as for whatever Google or I don't know, can sort of know things. It's absurd to think that. It's absurd to believe that. It's absurd to think that the purpose of all these crazy, incredible, somewhat incomprehensible to us events, whether that be, let's say, Alexander's campaigns or the Crusades, or the history of literature, or the history of mapping the world geographically, or the history of inventing different technologies, the history of geopolitical struggles and war, religion, whatever, is just so some nerd who hasn't really lived a day in their life can know things like trivia. Who wants to be a millionaire? Pick an answer. Okay, so there's a lot to say on this in general. I suppose the risk of this knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I mean, I think a lot of this essay is really describing, and I think it's actually in one passage that I forgot to read out, but there's something about like the intellectuals who have become like rabble. Like the rabble and the intellectuals here are kind of molding into the same thing. Modern education, historical education, modern science has given the rabble and the kind of learned this a very similar character. I think there's a lot of what Nietzsche is describing in The Last Man is the collapse of a distinct character or spirit between the rabble and the learned. I think this is key to understanding what The Last Man is. It's a collapse of that distinction. It's almost like the learned have become rabble-like in their character, and the rabble have become learned in their knowledge. But like the rabble haven't, through that knowledge, transformed into more than rabble, into noble, into heroes, into whatever, something higher, geniuses, like real artists, real geniuses, real thinkers, real noble people. They've just sort of been given knowledge. There's been a sort of like knowledge has failed to transform rabble into higher men, and it's also excused the learned to sort of collapse into rabble at the same time as it kind of crossing over here. This is really important. This collapse of the character of the learned, I think, is really important. So again, last men shouldn't be seen as like it's like a stupid peasant or something. Like the last man's not stupid; he's educated. The last man is exclusively educated. There's no last man without education. There's no last man without history. There's no last man without historical education, without scientific education, and so forth. I suppose in our time we'd also say technology is another big prerequisite for the last man. So stupidity or ignorance or kind of traditional rabbleness isn't what the last man is. The last man is a fusion between the rabble and the learned. It's a kind of incest almost. So anyway, let's check I'm recording. Yeah. The point of history then is sort of indicated too here a little bit by Nietzsche. He gives us something to work with if we're wondering, well, what's the use? We're describing the abuses of history a lot here. What's the use of history then? And he says this, I'll read this out. Only through joy does the way go to redemption. To redemption from that misunderstood owl-like seriousness. The time will come in which people wisely refrain from all constructions of the world process or even of human history, a time in which people in general no longer consider the masses but once again think about the individuals who construct a sort of bridge over the chaotic storm of becoming. So again, just this is a good because this was very early in Nietzsche's career of writing. Here, this is one of his very early works. He's developing this idea of overcoming and of the Übermensch and of this. He's got this fabulous, Zarathustrian analogies of the tightrope walker and overcoming, and man being a bridge and all the rest. And this is sort of important because this traversing, we have to think of this as like, well, what are we traversing? Like, what is this bridge going over? It's going over the abyss in Zarathustra. Here it's going over the rabble, right? So is the rabble and the abyss somehow kind of analogous to each other? I'm not sure. Maybe Nietzsche just sort of changed his viewpoint of what we should be building a bridge over. I mean, he's giving us a bridge building exercise here. He's giving us like a bridge building task, a project. Actually, he's kind of coming up with a project. It's going over something, right? We can say that bridges always go over something, and they connect 2 points. So they go over something. Normally, it's a river, or an ocean, or a canyon, or something, and then it connects 2 points, which is the two sides of the river, or the canyon, or the ocean, or whatever. So, yeah. So I mean, you got to think about that. What's it going over, and what's it connecting? So I'll just keep reading. These people do not set out some sort of process, but live timelessly and contemporaneously, thanks to history, which permits such a combination. So history, so end quote for a second. If we use history properly, it's giving us the capacity to live timelessly and contemporaneously. So basically, that means live kind of in the eternal, but also in the particular. The sort of, we could say the particular and the universal can kind of be in harmony with each other, we could say, in other words. Okay, They live like the republic of geniuses, about which Schopenhauer once explained that one giant. In which Schopenhauer once explained that one giant shouts out to another across the barren intervals of time, and undisturbed by the wanton and noisy midgets who creep around them, the giants continue their lofty spiritual conversation. The task of history is to be a mediator between them, and thus to support an opportunity and the energies for the development of greatness. No, the goal of humanity cannot finally be anywhere but in this, in its greatest examples. So, so the it's going over this kind of these midgets, these kind of chaotic, um, people in between, the rabble, the abyss, the midgets, and it's connecting people through time. I mean, it's connecting geniuses through time. It's allowing a kind of conversation, we could say, to happen through time. And philosophy really, really does have this character to it. Like, you really do have to kind of, to do philosophy properly, there is a deeply historical character to it. You do have to engage with a previous philosophical tradition. I mean, obviously, you're going to focus more on a handful of preferred philosophers, because you can't do all of them. But you sort of pick a kind of, it's almost like you pick an ancestry in some sense, a kind of spiritual ancestry. You sort of pick with it, and you read it, you discuss it, and you engage with it. And now, obviously, there's also the in our time social bridging as well, to build a bridge with other people who are interested in these things. That's another task. That's another bridge building exercise, which perhaps we won't get into in this conversation because it's less historical. It's more sort of immediate. But I suppose to even do that, you first need to build a bridge to these sort of geniuses through time, and this conversation does go through time. It's quite remarkable how this works. Now, it's kind of a one-sided conversation, because Nietzsche can't have a conversation with me, but I can sort of have a weird conversation with him. But nonetheless, he could have a conversation with the ancient Greeks and Schopenhauer and all the rest. So it's and Hegel and whatever. So that is I suppose one of the good functions of history, is to mediate between people in different points of time who are having these great spiritual conversations. And this is necessary to provide an opportunity for the energies of the development of greatness. Okay, so I'm going to finish up this installment here. I will probably come back and do one last recording for the last few pages, because there's also some kind of important stuff going on in those pages, which probably use another video for that. But yeah, just a few words on this this task of building a bridge, in which giants can have spiritual conversations over the rabble and over the midgets. This midget traversing exercise is, I think, interesting. I suppose it deals a lot with the energetics of life, framed historically, because it's often the case that, for example, typically, we know that Napoleon was influenced by Caesar was influenced by Alexander was influenced by myth. Alexander was influenced by, well, it probably was a few people that he was influenced by in real Greek history too, I think. Probably like Alcibiades, for example. Or Themistocles, but, so you go back far enough and you eventually go into a kind of mythological, blurry terrain. And I suppose the purpose of myth also was, I think, to write about vague stories of the past that weren't scientifically sort of verifiable in the modern sense of history. The Greek myths and legends, or the Norse legends, or whatever. sort of do touch upon, you know, kind of, you could maybe in a Jungian sense, they're archetypal, and you know, they sort of go into a eternal archetypal understanding of the of existence, but they also play into, you know, particular characteristics of a particular people in a landscape, for example, in a climate, and they also do go back into history because, for example, the Iliad, Homer in general, he's not writing history, but he's describing historical realities about, for example, Bronze Age warfare, and he's using myth to describe it. But he is describing historical reality as well. He's not simply, and we do know actually because of Schliemann, I can't remember his first name, this German archaeologist in the 19th or the 20th, I think it was 20th century, could have been the 19th century, found Troy, like it was a real place. So the myth is always a little bit historical. It's not historical by modern kind of scientific standards, but it does contain actually potentially scientifically verifiable truths, as in the case of Troy. So, you know, there's this sort of reference point, I suppose, this reference point in conversation, which is going back through these moments of history, and they operate as points of identification, motivation, inspiration, rivalry. Rivalry is a big thing. I don't think we speak about it enough. The rivalry between people in different points of history. It is a kind of largely undiscussed phenomena of inspiration and identification, and context and a reference point, kind of building of consciousness, we could say, not just with the people who are physically around us in our own life, but with people who have been long dead, but have been written down in the records of history. Kind of building a kind of rivalry or a friendship, or even a kind of conversation with, although it's a kind of a one-sided conversation, but still, this is really a helpful thing to do this is one of the, I suppose, benefits of history that Nietzsche is trying to elucidate on here. But in order to do this, it does draw us into the task of being able to, what we might call like intersubjective relation. It's a kind of intelligence. It's an intelligence in the capacity to relate intersubjectively. This is a thing that I've noticed is really hard for people to do today, to sort of, and I think someone recently made a tweet that was very relevant, and it's basically what we call presentism. Presentism is basically when you adopt very easily contemporary kind of sentiments and attitudes and behaviors, and you kind of think these are universal. You think these are just the way it always were. You don't really have it doesn't cross your mind even that people used to do things differently. And then go, why do people do things differently? Was that good actually? You know, was that like, what's the, you know? So for example, when we watch a film of a historical figure like Napoleon, I think I talked about this already, but the Napoleon film that came out like a year or two ago, that was a complete failure of historical intersubjective relation. It was a complete failure of that. The people who made the show had no idea how to relate to anything outside of their own contemporary, present framework. A human being to them doesn't exist outside their, and there is a kind of intelligence here in being able to understand that people were different. You know, in the past, people were different, and you can read about them. You can read things they wrote, perhaps. You can sort of study the kind of world they're in, the kind of all the context of the world they're in, all, you know, geographically, whatever, technologically, politically, and all the rest. But there's fundamentally a intelligence which gives one the capacity to think about a Caesar or a Napoleon or whoever, or even people like the people that were living in like whatever medieval Europe, or the people that were living in a hunter-gatherer society, or the people that were living in a early modern society or whatever, and being able to sort of see in what sense that they are similar and different, and or different to us, right? And that is a cult. That is a sort of observing the distinctions between us and history is a sort of intelligence that not everyone has. Actually, I would actually say that most people don't have it. Certainly nowadays. One of these issues of The Last Man is exactly that he doesn't have that. Like, he can't understand. He thinks everyone's silly. Like, as I said before, and this is a Fukuyama thing to say, but to simply look back and say, oh, look at those silly Protestants and Catholics, or silly Crusaders fighting those Muslims. Like, to look back and just kind of dismiss people as being not as well informed as you is a kind of stupidity. It's a kind of stupidity which makes real history impossible. So when we do historical education, we take out our textbooks and we learn things, and we study facts and dates, and we increasingly these days supplement that with a kind of very cheap moral judgment most of the time, just as Nietzsche's describing. But we don't really have the capacity to like truly intersubjectively relate to historical peoples. And that is a kind of stupidity which would need to be overcome for history to be worth anything, for this conversation of giants over great distances to be comprehensible. That would be necessary to cultivate.